problem with Christianity.
The problem with Christianity.
Problem with Christianity.
Problem with Christianity is they just want to take the fun out of everything.
The problem with Christianity is
The
just all
problem with
it is.
Christianity is that I know Christians that don't live out what they
Christianity
say.
is that it's so
Exclusive. How can only
judgmental towards
Christians
sexual
go to heaven?
orientation.
Allow death and destruction
How can it be
and
the only
war
way?
in our world.
Would a loving God really send that many people to hell?
It's no different than Greek
The problem with
mythology.
Christianity is you can't
God.
scientifically
How do you know
prove
God's
God.
real?
Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see you all today. I'm going to get right underway, and I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to open it with just a personal story that was from yesterday. I went over to WSU to go visit my daughter. It was Dad's weekend, and so I hung out over there. Couldn't stay for the game. Watched it last night. Go Cougs, we won. That was great. But I live in an interesting space, is what I realized yesterday. I live in an interesting space because every single day I live in two unique realities. I live in the reality of being an evangelical conservative pastor, but I also have an unbelieving gay son. And if you're new with us today, that's maybe something you didn't know about me. And so every day, not like every once in a while, every day I have these two realities before me, right? And what that causes you to do when you have to live in that tension, in that space, is that you see the pain in both communities. You see the conviction in both communities. You see the confusion that exists maybe within both communities. And so I had a friend of mine this week send me a podcast. They said, hey, you might want to listen to this, just really interesting, that kind of thing. So I started listening to that podcast in Colfax on my way home, and I wept all the way to Othello, and not for the drive, all right? So I wept because the podcast captured the reality of those pains and those challenges. And again, I want to be clear, I'm a person that 100% believes this book, believes the Bible, believes it's God's word. That's not the question for me. But what I realize is God's word, as it touches reality, is always going to have that kind of pain and challenge, and you have to work through what the implications of all of this really is on a daily basis. And so I say all of that because honestly, last week and this week has just kind of throttled me internally. I found it just, I want to so badly communicate the realities of what the Bible says, but I know I'm doing that also in a climate and in a time, in a space for people that is always hard. To have an unbelieving child and then to speak on hell last week is very challenging as a speaker. And then to speak on the topic of today, which is about sexuality, is very challenging as a pastor who, again, 100% believes the Bible and fiercely loves his child. That's just a challenge. So I say all of that. I don't know if it's a disclaimer. I don't even know quite why I'm saying it, other than it's a burden of my heart. And I'm asking you to pray for me today. Right? Pray for me and pray for this message that I can honor Jesus and honor his word and love and empathize with people. That's the heart behind this whole thing. And so if you'd pray for me, I'm going to pray right now, and then we're going to get right underway. Jesus, I thank you for your healing grace. I thank you for your patience with us. I thank you that you remind us all the time of our humanness, and yet you still love us in our humanness. And I thank you for your word and your gospel that brings freedom. And I pray all of those things would coalesce today in such a way that you are honored, people are loved, that your gospel is clear, and the reality of our frailty is owned. And so I ask for you to do a work today. And I ask you to do it again in your power, in your spirit, in your truth, and in your love for us. In your good name. Amen. So I think it's safe to say that more than ever in American society, we are more open, we are more graphic, we are more celebratory, and we are ultimately more non-repressive about the subject of sex than ever before. I think that is relatively safe to say. So it's a commonplace in television or movies to see this theme. It's a standard joke in sitcoms or stand-up comedy. It is the cornerstone of much of the marketing that we see. It doesn't matter if it's marketing for sports or marketing for beer or marketing for clothing or marketing just for the most random things like hamburgers. Somehow we've sexualized it in some capacity. It is a topic that has gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and obviously, as we've seen just in recent months, it's a topic that's even consumed people who are chosen potentially to serve on the court, and there's been much tension around that as well. It is graphically accessible on our phones and our tablets and our computers. It's emotionally accessible as you reconnect with old flames and friends on social media. It is physically accessible. You simply go on an app and you swipe right and you can have access to whatever you may be interested in. And of course, it is socially celebrated as everybody is encouraged to be free to be me. What I find interesting about all of this is for all of the exposure, we don't seem sexually healthy as a society. Like, it just seems challenging. And see, this is interesting to me because the thought was part of the problem we have as human beings is that we are too repressed. And if we just kind of allow this to be more natural, more normal, more open, more kind of brought into our lives, that is going to free us to be healthier sexually. And yet what we have found repeatedly is the more we've brought it in, the more it feels like something is amiss, something is broken, something is not quite right. And so with that, there has been this weird kind of bipolar disposition as an American culture when it comes to sexuality. We've sent mixed messages. So for example, we've said, it's just sex. It's just sex. But at the very same time we're saying it's just sex, there's also this message that says, but there's a lot of people wounded and hurt and fragile because of this thing that's just sex. And so it's either just sex or it's deeply personal and challenging when misapplied and misused. And so that's created a little bit of this kind of bipolar thing. Or for example, it's a weird thing that we so inundate our entertainment with it, right? Like, so you get home, you turn on the television, it is just there saturating the whole time. But when you punch into work the next day, if you so much make any hint of what you watched on TV the night before that's sexual, you're going to have HR contact you. So it's like, hey, this is totally good for entertainment, but it's completely inappropriate in the workplace. We're like, okay, so this is good or this is bad, or what do I do with that? It's just kind of created this bipolar thing. We filled our minds with it vividly. But then if somebody tries to act on it in any way and the person says, no, I'm not interested in you, they see it as some type of threat or an assault. We've seen people feeding their natural impulses, but then tragically saying, hey, it's not that bad, it's no big deal, it's just sex. But then they act on those impulses in ways that actually violate other people. And so we have this whole mess. It's this inconsistent culture that we're not sure what to do with. We saw it even just in recent months where we see this confusion in that one of the founders of the Me Too movement was also #guilty too, right? So the very thing she wanted to fight was the very thing she herself had done. This is a part of that confusion, that lack of clarity, that bipolar nature. Now, I want you to hear me this morning. My mission, my goal, my heart is not to be one of those ranting evangelicals that talk about how everything is broken in society. See, my heart is very different. I'm not interested in that game. I'm not really excited when I see pastors get on the news or television and rant about those things because I actually look at it differently. I don't look in terms of, oh, well, there's the perverted society and here's the godly position. I look and I go, I think there's a lot of wounded, broken, hurting people with lots of pain and baggage in the context of this. See, I think our culture is wounded and needs encouragement and direction and inspiration and love and compassion more than it needs some ranting, scolding pastor. Because here's what's true. There are rape fears. I have a daughter at a college or a state university. There are rape fears. They go to classes just for that topic. They have to go to special seminars when you plug into WSU just on that topic, right? But equally, there are fears that you'll be accused of something you didn't do, right? So there's fears on both sides. There is real sexual harassment, and there are real fears about being accused falsely of sexual harassment. There are men, women, and children who are victims of #MeToo. There's abusive and exploitive relationships. There's infidelity. And there's apps and websites to fuel the desire for infidelity. There is pornography of the most taboo nature that exploits other human beings simply for money, right? There's promiscuity that goes on that writes on people's hearts and souls and minds and personal securities and insecurities. And man, there are marriages without sexual intimacy and union, and that is all due to other sexual dysfunctions. And so there's all this stuff. And so in this weird way, the sexual revolution has left us with a lot of sexual refugees, right? That's probably the weirdest part. And part of the problem in this, at least to me, is that the refugees exist not simply because the revolution maybe taught them and told them and promised them things that didn't come about, but on the other end of this, and this is where it comes home to roost in me, and part of the reason I wept all the way from Colfax to Othello is because as all of that has happened, the Christian community, where it could have had this message of forgiveness and hope and cleansing and everything else, it kind of added to the fire of the revolution. And had this response reaction that was probably way more about judgment and legalism and inconsistency, things we've talked about before, than it really was about how do you bring the Bible to bear on broken lives and broken culture and broken people. And so all of that is what is driving us to look at the topic today as we continue the series on the problem with Christianity. And that is the problem with Christianity to some people in some ways is they look and they go, it is sexually repressive. It shames, it guilts, it judges, it wants to just shut down all dialogue. Now, if you have our app, there are notes on the app and you can follow along in those notes today. Also, as I keep saying, I cannot address every issue, and boy, today is no exception. And you may have some questions about today, and you can text those questions in, and we'll address those in our podcast that will go live on Tuesday. We certainly welcome that. And as we do, I want you to understand this is a message of goodwill on my part. This is what I'm trying to do. And in this, I want us to understand that I am not going to be some shock jock pastor today that says things that make you feel really uncomfortable and sheepish and just, I've done that before. That's not today. Matt is on his best behavior today, all right? It would be one of those days I can make a lot of jokes and everything else, but I go, no, I think the climate demands more of a hopeful sobriety in all of this. Because like I said, I think there are many of us in this room that could put #MeToo on their lives. I think that's true. I think there's many of us in this room that have a story where you were wounded. You have insecurities or baggage that you're dealing with. Maybe your story is you know you wounded others because you went to places you shouldn't have gone, or you've brought on addictions to your life that you wish you could get rid of, or you had things in your life that you just go, I'm ashamed, and if anybody knew, I would be so distraught. And some of you are maybe even hiding things where right now you're going down paths where you know this is reckless and dangerous, and it's only going to harm people. All of that, I believe, is in play in this room, and probably a majority at some level. I don't mean you're doing something now, but you've had something happen, had something done, your family was hurt by some kind of infidelity problem, pornography, whatever it is, more mess than not. Right? This is why the church is a hospital. Which is so weird because too often we sound like the referees of morality and culture as opposed to a hospital for the wounded. And so from that, like I said, I want you to know my heart today is to bring clarity and healing and wholeness. And so I'm going to look at three different elements of this. First, I'm going to look at the real failures on the part of culture as it relates to this topic. That's going to be one thing. Second thing I'm going to look at is the real failure on the part of Christianity in our culture as it relates to this topic. And then the last part will be real solutions from the Bible and Jesus on this. Because you know what? Here's what I'm certain of. The Bible is not about being regressive and controlling and repressive, but rather it's about being refreshing and hopeful and encouraged and forgiven. And that's something that at times I think Christianity has not always done a great job within our society. I think we haven't been the best ambassadors of the Bible and of Jesus on this topic. But I don't want to start with this as Christians. I want to start with culture. And so if you're following along in your notes, number one, I want to look at the cultural development of the sexual revolution. Isn't that exciting? A history lesson. Yay, us, all right? Now, some of you are going to say, I know when the sexual revolution began. It was in the 60s with those freaky hippies, right? That's what you're going to naturally think. But we have to push it back further to the roaring 20s, right? Which is a crazy time in American society. There's a lot of things that was crazy. And there's a woman, her name is Leanne Wheeler, that wrote a book called How Sex Became a Civil Liberty. She is a historian out of the University of New York, not a person of faith to my knowledge or anything like this. This is a secular research book, a historian, and she tracks the relationship of the ACLU to the growth in civil liberty as it pertains to areas of sexuality. So that's just her whole mission. That's what she goes through. And so she looks at the founders of the ACLU, which was Crystal Eastman, Roger Baldwin, and then Baldwin's wife, Madeline Dottie. And it's an interesting book, like 7-point font, tons of footnotes, just a total history dissertation on this topic. And this is what she looks at. She says from kind of the teens, the 1910 to 1920 range, these three individuals kind of came together. And they did so under a very unique dynamic. They all had sexual interests that were outside of the acceptable norm of American society. And in light of that, they're like, this is really strange because doesn't the Constitution protect our freedoms in this? And they're like, well, clearly local laws do not. And so they kind of formed together and eventually became the ACLU because they wanted to really advance the idea that said, you know what, sexuality should be more open in society, not less, and that would free us more as opposed to enslave us because they felt judged and enslaved. In fact, as one writer said, the ACLU sought to reform sexual speech, expression, and behavior is integral to the First Amendment. So this becomes kind of the priority of this organization. In time, it expanded to do many other things, but this is how it starts. And so from the 1920s to 1930s, they centered on freedom of speech. And I think most of us in the room were like, hey, we believe in freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is healthy and good. They particularly looked at freedom of speech as it dealt with unconventional conversation about sex. They said, you know what, really, if we're going to have freedom of speech, then we should be allowed to talk about things in this realm that are considered taboo because that should be protected by the First Amendment. So they focused legally on that a lot during the 1920s to 1930s. From the 1940s to 1960s, according to this book, they then focused on, having kind of gotten to the point that says maybe you can talk about it and be protected as free speech, they focused next on the idea of something that's familiar to us, which is consumer rights. Which you go like, hey, I like consumer rights. I want to be protected. Well, that's one of the implications of consumer rights. But they focused on the idea of saying the consumer has rights, ready, to consume whatever they desire. And so they began to work within the court system and says, you know what, you cannot restrict what consumers desire to consume. And from that, it was very much like a consumer, if they desire to consume things of a sexual nature, they should be allowed to do that. Hence, here's why you can buy Playboy by the 1960s and 70s. The consumer has the right to certain materials, and so they worked through the court that way. After that, from the 40s to 60s, they also dealt with this idea of the right to privacy. Kind of a new thing, actually, in some legal respects. Matter of fact, you ever heard the phrase, the government should stay out of my bedroom? Or this idea that government shouldn't be allowed in there? Well, that was born completely out of this idea of to fight for the right for privacy. Because here's what they looked at. They said, you know, the state has all these laws against certain sexual practices, but my First Amendment right will trump all of those laws. If I can prove my First Amendment right says I have freedom to privacy and freedom to speech and freedom to consume what I want, if that is true, then all these local laws don't matter anymore. And so they worked hard toward the right to privacy. The right to privacy in that same period, then kind of going into the late 60s and 70s, moved into then the right to have a choice over your own body, because if it's between you and your doctor and it's a privacy right, then you have rights over your reproduction. And that led to the right to federal protected abortion. And so that was developed. And then in the 70s and 80s, they went further and sought to ease access to sexual expression. So some of you that are old enough, you will remember there was a debate all the way up to the Supreme Court that said, what is the difference between art and pornography? And from this, there was this, well, what's art, what's pornography? And then they decided, well, basically pornography is art. And that's why it's legal today, and you can get it on your phone, and you can get it on your computer, and you can get it anywhere, because again, it's ultimately just freedom of expression. Even in 1990, Two Live Crew, remember those guys? Yep, Two Live Crew. They were banned in the USA because they had a song As Nasty As They Want to Be, and it was banned in Florida because it violated local decency laws, but it went up through the court system, and it was shown, nope, you're allowed to say that and sing that, and you can't suppress that. So that's been the trajectory legally and culturally, so that by the time you do get to the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s and everything else, it's like dried tinder, and then you have that generation that's like, well, we don't want to be like our post-war parents, we want to do what we want to do and how we want to do it, and it just sort of ignited and accelerated. And then we had technology, got the internet, where we could put so much more of this access into our pocket, into the privacy of our own homes, right? So all of this is kind of this tension that we live in, and it shaped the culture, right? And it was from that Christianity then had a counter. Because we saw this happening, it felt like it was spiraling out of control and everything else, and yet in our humanness, instead of having a really thoughtful, Bible-focused, gospel-centered response, we had a bit more of a reaction. And that's number 2 in your notes. The Christian reaction to the sexual revolution. Now here's the thing I have seen, and I've done this myself. The natural reaction to what is perceived to be a threat for human beings is fear. Now for the Christian, it should be faith. Jesus is very clear. Why are you afraid? Why do you fear? You do everything in the context of faith, but our tendency is to fear. Again, when I first found out my son was gay, I guarantee you my reaction wasn't faith, it was fear. And when we fear, what do we try to do? We try to control. We try to subvert. We try to shut down and suppress. In essence, we become this idea of a kind of regressive and oppressive and everything else. And that's sort of what began to happen even within the Christian community in the United States. We wanted to clamp it down. We wanted to kind of push it away and shut it out. And so we had these reactions as Christian families and individuals and pastors. One reaction, I'm going to call it the first reaction, they're not in order, but I think they're just different reactions we had, was the reaction of silence. In other words, as parents were raising their kids during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever it was, there was this reaction that says, you know what, it's going on out there, but we don't talk about it in here, in our home. What we do is we give you one birds and the bees talk where mom or dad is very awkward the whole time, and then there's moms and dads and they wrestle and, whatever. Like this awkward one-time talk. And then we say, so between now and your wedding day, no and don't, here's a purity ring. And it's all bad until one day you say some stuff before your pastor, and now it's totally good, go do it. Right? And so it's this jarring thing. It's all bad, don't stop, don't touch, don't anything. Suddenly, oh, go do it. Whoa! But that was the consequence of the silence. There was a challenge in that. My wife and I have met with many couples that they say, man, that's been the big hurdle. I was raised that it's bad, it's wrong, it's dirty, it's awful, and then I get married and it's suddenly supposed to be okay, good, and beautiful, and wonderful. And there was just this jarring effect because there wasn't conversation. It was just silence. We don't talk about such things in our home. And with that, it wasn't, transparent or ongoing or empathetic or journeying with their teens in the process. It was just sort of leaving them to their own wonders and curiosities and friends who informed them and other outlets that were maybe bad. And so, again, silence contributed to part of the problem. The other thing that happened in this was the reaction of shame. Shame. So, as people maybe revealed things about themselves sexually that were outside of the Bible, where Christianity would disagree, they were seen as perverts. It was a shaming tool. Or there was shame for those who didn't live up to the Christian standard of sexual ethics. Or there was shame for those who gave in to their temptations. So, for example, there were gay kids who were kicked out of their families as opposed to pulled in. It's amazing how many homeless gay teens are still in the United States, right? It's amazing, even having done podcasts and everything else on this topic, how many families from around the world have contacted Ellen and myself, and they struggle because they're like, what do we do? Do we kick out our child? Do we love our child? What do we do with our child? And there was a lot of Christians that just said, all right, if that's what you're going to do, you're out the door, go. You're not my kid anymore. There was daughters. There was daughters who went too far. And from that, their fathers, who should have been there to love them and come alongside them and say, I understand, instead would call them names and say shameful things and make them feel dirty and awful for the fact that they went to places that maybe they didn't even want to fully go. It's just like, he said he loves me and I didn't know and I didn't want to lose him and all that. And there was just this shame, there was this guilt, there was this sense of harshness. And man, if you got pregnant in that context, it's amazing how many families said, if you get pregnant, guess what? You can't live here anymore. I mean, that was the shaming that went on. I can't help but wonder how many Christian teenage girls, for example, went and sought abortions, not because they really wanted to do that, but because they didn't want to face their father or their families who were going to shame them for what had happened. So they go down and they violate their conscience in a completely different way just because they're trying to avoid the shame, and then they have a private shame in a different way, right? So mess. Or I think about young boys who are trying to just figure out things because, man, when the biology kicks on, it kicks on. And they get curious about things, and then they get caught in their curiosity, and there's mom saying, that's disgusting, that's perverted, that is wrong. And then, again, it creates this internal shame instead of dialogue and coming alongside, and I'm going to invest in you, and I care. There was this really powerful shaming apparatus that then taught people, man, you just don't talk about this. This doesn't come up at all, right? As opposed to help and direction and healing, guidance. This even became kind of a thing that was just kind of political and ultimately kind of social, where pretty soon Christianity identified those are the sexual outcasts. They're like the lepers, right? I think about even when the AIDS epidemic broke out, the church was like, well, this is the cost of your sin. It's just that's what happens to you. Heartless, callous, cold, unempathetic, non-gospel centered. That's just what happened. And part of this goes back to the third thing then, which is the reaction of scandal. We just treated everything like a scandal, right? And if it's a scandal, if you had an affair, if you struggled with pornography, if you were promiscuous in some way, if you were gay, whatever it was like a scandal. It was like, oh no, outcast judgment. We're going to talk about them, right? If somebody in your church did something like that, it wasn't like, man, how do we rally around that person and love on them? It was more like, did you know what so-and-so did? Do you know what happened? Did you hear? Oh, I can't believe it. See, these were the products that came about. And so the net effect was this regressive theme. I mean, in other words, when they say Christianity is too kind of repressive and regressive and stifling, the reality was, in a lot of ways, it was. And it did real damage, right? It did real damage. And I think there has to be ownership of that fact. So, like I said, the gay community is one that, because I have so much regular interaction with, I see a little uniquely. So many kids were told flatly, there's no room in your family for you anymore. Do you know what that does to a teenage kid? Who they're like, I'm already confused enough as it is, and this is who I think I am. And then the family says, well, if you're that, you're not with us. There was no question in my mind why the drug use rate is so high among gay teens and the suicide rate is so high among gay teens from Christian homes. We had a mother call us just this week, or last week it was, from Tennessee. And she's like, we just found out about our son. My husband is a deacon in a Baptist church, and we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. Because if we love him, our community is going to ostracize us. But if we don't love him, which is really counterintuitive, we feel like we're going to destroy him. It's a very complicated place. And she was speaking from just the experience of what she had seen, what they had felt to be true. Like I said, real damage. I think about it as this tone at times has hurt Christian marriages. Right, where there was struggle and shame around things of sexuality, and then people get married, and all of that baggage comes in, and so there's still confusion, and there's still a lack of communication, and there's still awkwardness in there, all because of some of the things that maybe Christians at times did in silence or shaming or whatever the tactic was. I think about the wounding that happens as people struggle. Right, as they fall victim to their own temptations or whatever else, and then from that they feel like it's just judgment or coldness or gossip or a lack of empathy in our lives. And then ultimately, what I have found is when it's silence or shame or scandal, it had this tendency to drive sin underground, right? Where people couldn't come and say, here's where I'm struggling, without feeling like they were going to be looked at in this, ooh, you're weird, now I don't want to be around you way. So they hide it, and then they become more entrenched in their things. See, all of this is tragic. Because here's the deal, here's what I've kind of come to realize. Both sides, the sexual revolution and Christian kind of repressiveness, both sides wanted to help. Right? Both sides wanted to help. One side wanted to say, hey, we're going to free you by saying no more rules. The other side said, we're going to free you by trying to really show you the suffering involved, because we'll be in part the tool of the suffering, right? Like both sides were trying to help. So I think both sides had these motivations of wanting to be an aid, but like most conflicts, it just created refugees, right? Wounded, broken, hurting. Tragedy. And it doesn't surprise me, because here's something I've come to know from reading the Bible. Satan loves to divide. He loves to catch a lot of people in the middle of the conflict. In fact, I like the way C.S. Lewis put it in the Screwtape Letters. This is this fictional piece of work about a master demon training a lower demon. And this is what he says. He says, all extremes except extreme devotion to the enemy, who is God, because it's demons talking. All extremes except extreme devotion to the enemy are to be encouraged. In other words, Satan doesn't care if we're completely repressive or we're completely accepting, as long as we're so extreme that what gets lost in the middle is the gospel. As long as what gets lost in the middle is Jesus, as long as what gets lost in the middle is hope and opportunity and true freedom, he's fine with either end of the spectrum, right? Be a moral zealot or just be making up all the moral rules as you go. Either extreme is fine. So, in those extremes, there were wounds. And this is why I love Jesus and I love the Bible, because I think it centers us from our extremes. And so that's number 3 in your notes, the Bible's message and response on sexuality. The Bible's message and response on sexuality, I neither believe it's silence and shaming, nor do I believe it is permissive and unrestricted. Rather, when I read the Bible, I see that it is celebration and encouragement and promotion, and it is equally caution and warning and prohibition. Both are true. And I want to start with the positives. And I want to start with some things that maybe as a Christian, you know these things to be true. I get that. Much of this message, and we know a lot of people are watching online, and maybe some of you are a guest in the room and you're not a Christian and you're trying to get where Christians come from. There's things that I realize that people outside of the church assume about the Bible and the church that they don't maybe fully realize what the Bible actually says. And so I want to share some things that are important on this subject. And so the first thing in the notes that you have is the Bible promotes sex in bold ways. It promotes it in bold ways. For example, did you know it is the very first command of the Bible? The very first. In fact, in the very first page, it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Right off the bat. Then you go into chapter 2 where it tells the story from a different kind of point of view. And he says, therefore the man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That is their sexual intimacy. And it says the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Like, for people outside of the church who are like, wait a minute, get this straight. So nudity was okay, and sex was okay, and it was the first command. I'm like, yes, God made them. And says, get busy like bunnies. Go, quick. Like that was like a massive endorsement in the Bible, and I think that blows people's minds, right? No, this is this Puritan book that doesn't say stuff like that. No, it totally says stuff like that. It totally says stuff just like that. And here's what's really cool about it. It wasn't just for procreation. Some people grow up in the Catholic Church, and they think that God only gave that so you could have really big families, and it's just a functional thing, and try to stay away from it as much as possible, except when you want to have kids. But the Bible actually says that it was for pleasure. It speaks of it as pleasurable in the Bible. I worked with a guy back in the day before I was a pastor, and we were talking one day as we were working, and he goes, yeah, but the Bible is totally against it for any kind of enjoyment reasons. I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, yeah, I know the Bible says it's wrong except to make people. So I took him to this passage. It's out of Proverbs. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a lovely deer, as a graceful doe, let her breasts fill you at all times with delight, and be intoxicated always in her love. He's like, no way. Right? It's like, that can't be in the Bible. It's like the Book of Mormon or something. I'm like, no, man. It's in the Bible. Like, some of you are blushing like, I can't believe it's in the Bible. There's stuff in the Bible I can't read without getting in trouble on a Sunday morning. Right? And so it's pleasurable. I mean, that is so critical. I mean, some of you are like, I'm already blushing. I don't know what to do. I need to fan it off, right? So, but it's in there. And so it's good to put it in a pleasurable context. Here's another one that's really crazy. The Bible, as it talks about being the first command and talks about it being pleasurable, also advocates that we teach it, ready? To teenagers. We actually teach it out loud, verbally, repetitively, often in a celebratory fashion. There's an entire book of the Bible dedicated just to that topic. I think there's people that don't realize that. It's this book called Song of Solomon. And if you read Song of Solomon, it is this interaction between a husband and a wife, and it's beautiful, and it's pleasurable, and it's graphic, and it's celebratory, where they're like, okay, we're married, so we're going to do this indoors and outdoors at your mom's house, at my house. I mean, it's like that. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this stuff up. It is literally like that. But here's the really cool part of the book. Repeatedly throughout the book, the woman is telling the virgins, the teenage girls. The man is telling the teenage boys constantly, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, it's here, it's there, and they're bragging about each other's physiques. I mean, again, this is the opposite of silence. It's constant repetition in the lives of teens. I mean, honestly, this is one of the best things Christian families can do. Not just one or two talks, and here's your purity ring, and don't till marriage. Model the Bible. Repetitive, often, making it a comfortable topic. Had a wonderful conversation with my oldest daughter who got married a year ago and is down here in the front row, where she was just telling us like a week ago, she's like, Mom and Dad, thank you so much for making this a regular topic because it was the most comfortable thing when I got married. We just made it a wonderful, regular, ongoing, non-awkward, I'm going to have that weird talk, head down, dotting away, just regular conversation. And in that, because some people go, oh, if you talk about it too much, they want to do it. Well, they talked about it a ton in this book, and yet this book also says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. So they'd say, this is what we're doing, I celebrate this person, but you know what? The best thing to do is wait on it. Don't awaken it too early. Wait on it. So both messages were there. It's so awesome. I'm going to tell you all the time. And one day you get to enjoy this too. But it was both in play. So the Bible talks about that. It talks about things boldly. Here's another one that easily gets overlooked. The Bible boldly advocates that it's sinful not to engage in it. Oh, that's a weird one. Paul says this. He says, because of sexual temptation, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, which is just a funny word to me. Conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And then all the feminists went, whoa, wait, but then it says this. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. This is the most bold, egalitarian equality statement that you would find 2,000 years ago. Suddenly, like, whoa, they both have equal measure over each other's bodies. That's an incredible idea, right? And therefore, it says, do not deprive one another. There's your command. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps for an agreed amount of time that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Not the kids, not your hobbies, not a headache, not a too busy, not your football game, whatever. For prayer, right? You're like, oh, I got to start praying a lot, right? So, like, for prayer. And then it says, let them come together again. And he goes on to say, lest Satan tempt you. And we always go, oh, well, Satan's going to tempt you to sexual sin if you don't do this. No, here's what Satan loves to do. He loves to tempt you to argue, to become disunified, to neglect one another, ignore one another, just have your separate lives. You used to have a love seat, now you have lazy boys, right? That's how Satan loves to tempt, when we don't come together in that act, right? It's funny, the Puritans, way back in the colonies, we always go, those Puritans. They had a very simple thing. Puritans were hilarious. They were like, you know what? Married couples really need to do this on a regular basis. So they actually wrote local laws that said you were required to at least twice a week. Yeah, the Puritans. Wild, all right? So I get it. Because here's what it's getting at. Sexless marriages are limited ones. Sexless marriages are at-risk ones. And so it commands that happens. But in this, there are other bold things that the Bible says. This is just scratching the surface, but I think the biggest bold thing that it says in today's society is that it is designed only for marriage. That's bold. That's bold in the time where we're like, no, you can't just say it's for marriage alone. I mean, come on. It's like, I'm single and I'm young and I'm alive or whatever. Like, you can't say, no, that's exactly what the Bible says. It says all those other things about it, and it also says it is for marriage. Jesus said it this way. He's repeating what is on the first page of the Bible. He says, have you not read that when he created them from the beginning, he made them male and female? And he said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. And whatever God has joined together, let no man separate. Now, an aware critic will say, wait, though, I've read the Bible. There's tons of prostitution. There's tons of polygamy. There's all kinds of concubines. There's all kinds of problems. I go, yeah, the Bible records a lot of bad behavior. Of course, a lot of bad behavior. But it certainly advocates a model. There's tons of misuse, but God had a particular use, and the particular use is to unify a husband and a wife. And anything beyond that, it's getting outside of the specs that God has for this idea of a husband and wife becoming one. It's outside of the specs. And so, for example, this summer I did a bunch of work in my yard with rock, and I have this utility trailer that can hold 1,800 pounds, but I decided to put 2,500 pounds of rock in it. Beyond the specs. I knew when the person dumped the load in the thing and the axle was bending and the tires were flat. Oh, it was beyond specs, man. I kind of just nursed that thing home, and I'm waiting for the bearings to go out on me next year because I just brutalized it so much. Well, it's the same thing. The Bible has specs. It has design. It has purpose. And therefore, if you're still taking notes, the Bible prohibits sex outside of design specs for caring reasons. For caring reasons. The Bible doesn't say what it says to ruin you, but to enrich you. It's not designed to limit you. It's designed to free you. See, God built us And in building us, he gave us a user's manual, right? And he's like, this is how you want to use this. This is how you don't want to use this. It's no different than when you buy some item like a chainsaw. And then when you're reading through the manual of the chainsaw, you run across that stick figure section of don't use your chainsaw for these things, like cutting fabric or dumb stuff or, your cheese in your kitchen. And it's like, it has design specs. You use it this way, it's going to bless you. You use it in wrong ways, it's going to hurt you and ruin you. In fact, our friend Paul again said it like this: all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. He says, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food. Therefore, from this extension, he says, the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Or literally, the Lord is for your body. He's for your body, right? Therefore, he says, or do you not know that he who's joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as is written, the two shall become one flesh. And in this sense, he's saying it's not a good thing, right? He says, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. There's a lot of stuff Paul's saying here, and I don't have time to break it all down, but here's the deal. He's saying just because it may be legal doesn't mean it's life enriching. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you may see it as just a physical act, it doesn't mean it's only a physical act, because there's so much more to it. We have to understand the Bible approaches humanity very holistically. It says we're body, mind, emotion, consciousness, we're psychological, we're communal, we're spiritual. And so with that, all of that comes in and pours into the idea of marriage. And so when we take this thing that God designed for this marital context and we pry it from a marital context and put it into other contexts, it's like there's a crossing of the wires. It's like it rewrites the code in a way where there's a lack of efficiency because, again, these things aren't necessarily meant to come together. It reminds me, and this is only going to be for people that change their own oil, you don't want to put standard and synthetic together, right? Because they don't really quite bond together in the same way. It kind of creates more of a mess than it does cohesion. And in the same way, he's like, man, this has this purpose, design, this function, this thing. It's this gift to this particular type of community and relationship called marriage. Husband and wife become one. All the other applications, while you can do it legally, you can make it happen. It's not what it's built for. And so there's going to be wounds and challenge and baggage and hardship and hurt. And like I said, there's a lot of it in society. There's just a lot of it. See, I look at this like skiing. Ski season's coming, excited, or snowboarding season for people that actually do the right thing on a mountain. And I kid. All right, so, but they have these signs saying out of bounds, warning, don't cross this. Trust me, ski resorts don't go, how can we ruin these people's day? Let's put up a warning, no boundary sign. No, they're saying, we want you to have the best time on the slopes. We want you to have the greatest day you can. That's why we put up signs. This is why God, over 60 times in the New Testament, says, flee sexual immorality. It's not like, because I want to hit you with a stick if you don't. He's like, flee because it's the misapplication and it's going to leave wounds. It's going to leave damage. It's going to do something bad in your life more than something good. It's going to take more than it gives. Flee. This is, I believe, the heart of God on this subject. And I would just simply maybe add this. If we were honest with ourselves, at least a lot of us, we would say, what is our personal experience, either A, us personally, or B, in people that we know who left God's parameters for this? Will we say that generally that's gone well, or that has left some marks? Has struggling with pornography gone well or left some marks? Has flirting with maybe not being faithful in your marriage, has it left marks or has it gone well? And the list can go on and on and on. Promiscuity, has it gone well or has it hurt? See, I don't mean shame and judgment and condemnation. I just mean, has it hurt? See, I think there is probably more of that potential. So I think Christianity has sometimes not done well. I think society has fueled things that have harmed people. But the Bible's message is for our good. And so with that, I think it's important that because of the Bible, Christians model the biblical response, not reaction, but the response. And That's a response of example and empathy in the areas of sex. Example and empathy. Here's the example part. We need to live it. We need to live it. If we're pointing at the brokenness of society, but we're not living it, that's hypocritical. Right? We need to go to war with our temptations and our challenges and everything else and lean into God's best, whether you're married or single or whatever. It's like, what's God's best? I want to celebrate that because, again, too often the world points at Christians and says, see, you're no different. You Catholics, you do this. You pastors that have affairs do that. You're no different. I'm like, you're absolutely right. The only difference is we have a standard that we tout in one sense and then break in another, and we show no empathy. And so we need to be examples. That's the first thing. But the second thing, like I said, is we need to have empathy. We need to admit that human beings are frail and challenged. And man, we picked up stuff through life, and we need to be caring, and we need to be loving and invested. I think about this with Jesus. He was so good at this, man. Jesus was so good at this. He hung around on a semi-regular basis with prostitutes, and they felt loved by him, and he did not exploit them at all. But they felt loved by him. I think about the woman caught in adultery. He doesn't shame her. He doesn't come on to her and crush her spirit. He protects her. He stands in the gap for her. Like, there's this thing about Jesus where I think we almost treat sex as the big, huge sin in the Bible, and I see where Jesus is always coming along people and alongside and loving them into something different and investing into them so that they might see wholeness again, like that kind of spirit, and that is where we need to be. Again, like I've said, if the LGBTQ community looks at Christians and they go, you don't love us, and you're not safe, and you kick us out, and you push us away, and we would never find a home among you. That is exactly why they're going to feel like, you know what? Christians are our enemies. Christians are our enemies. Or if there's somebody that has just struggled with their sexual decisions, and they go, but man, there's no home for me in Jesus or the gospel. We failed. We failed. We need to be that space. There was a radio interview this week. I close with this. Lauren Daigle, Christian artist, went on the Ellen DeGeneres show and sang some songs, and I didn't see it necessarily, but boy, she got a lot of blowback because she went on the show of a lesbian as a Christian artist. And so in this radio interview, she had some statements I think are really valuable for us to remember as Christians, because again, what we're trying to do is get Jesus and the gospel into the lives of people. And so she said this: it is not up to me to choose who I'm supposed to love. It's not up to me. Can't say, well, this group and that group. She says, I think the second we start drawing lines around which people we're able to approach and which we aren't, we've already completely missed the heart of God. I don't have all the answers in life, but one thing I know is that I can't choose who I'm supposed to be kind to and who I'm not, because that's the mission. That's just true. Jesus was a friend of the outcast, the broken, the downtrodden, the uncustomary. And the only way they are going to hear about the goodness and grace and forgiveness and healing of Jesus is if we do the same. Let's pray together. Jesus, I thank you for your grace. I thank you for your truth. I thank you for design. I thank you for forgiveness and healing. And I pray that we are faithful to all of that. It is so uncomfortable to live in the mess of what's real with your truth, but you did it so beautifully. May we follow your lead in your good name. Amen.